That night, in his towering penthouse overlooking Atlanta, James Whitmore found himself staring at the untouched dinner on the table before him. The perfectly grilled steak, the crisp asparagus, the glass of Bordeaux of it sat there, cooling under the soft glow of the chandelier. It was a meal meant for a man of his stature, a man who had everything, and yet, at that moment, it felt meaningless. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the memory of a young boy with worn-out sneakers and calloused hands, kneeling on the hot pavement to fix the tire of a man he didn't even know. James swirled the wine in his glass but didn't take a sip. He had spent his life surrounded by people who measured their worth in dollars and deals, where every interaction came with an expectation. Generosity, in his world, was transactional, a donation with a tax write-off, a favor with an unspoken debt, and yet Malik had walked away without taking a single thing. No request, no hesitation, no need to be repaid. It was unsettling in a way James couldn't quite explain. It made him question things he hadn't questioned in a long time. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the vast cityscape beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline was dazzling symbols of power and wealth stretching toward the heavens. He had built an empire in this city, forged his success through years of relentless ambition, and yet, as he sat in his silent, empty penthouse, he realized how hollow it all felt. He had spent decades chasing something: money, prestige, influence, but for the first time, he wondered if he had been chasing the wrong thing all along. He thought about Malik's hands, steady and sure as he worked, the quiet confidence in the way he tightened the bolts, the ease with which he moved, as if the task was second nature. But more than that, James remembered the way the boy had looked at him, not with admiration, not with intimidation, but as an equal. That moment had been so brief, so fleeting, yet it had shaken something loose inside him. James had grown up in a world that taught him success was about getting ahead, about rising above. His father had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and his mother had spent her days scrubbing floors in houses that looked a lot like the one James now owned. He had learned early that the only way to escape that life was to outwork, outthink, and outperform everyone around him, and he had. He had climbed his way out of that world, leaving behind the worn-out furniture, the tight budgets, the uncertainty. But Malik still lived in that world, and somehow, despite that, the boy carried himself with more dignity and self-assurance than men 3 times his age. He didn't have money or power, but he had something James had lost along the way: an unwavering sense of who he was. James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. He had spent his whole life measuring his success in numbers, in acquisitions, in the next big deal. But what was it all worth if he had lost sight of what truly mattered? He glanced down at his phone, still sitting on the table where he had placed it earlier. His notifications were filled with emails, meeting requests, and stock reports. Normally, he would have been checking them obsessively, making calls, planning his next move. But tonight, none of it seemed urgent. Instead, he opened a blank search bar and typed in a simple question. How far is Pinewood from Atlanta? His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he pressed enter. A map popped up, showing the route back to the quiet little town where Malik had walked away with nothing but a smile. James stared at it, his heartbeat steady but firm, as a decision formed in his mind. He didn't know exactly why he needed to go back. He only knew that, for the first time in years, something inside him was pushing him toward something real. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to listen. The next morning, James Whitmore found himself driving down the same stretch of road where he had been stranded the day before. The sun was barely up, casting a golden hue over the rolling Georgia landscape, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the boy who had walked away without asking for anything, Malik. The name echoed in his mind, pulling him forward with a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. James had spent his life making decisions based on logic, on calculated risks, on the certainty of numbers. But this wasn't logical. It wasn't part of a business strategy or a long-term plan. It was a feeling, a pull, something deep in his chest telling him he needed to find that boy. He needed to understand why their brief encounter had left him so unsettled, why he had spent the night staring at the Atlanta skyline feeling like he was missing something he couldn't name. The road was quiet, just as it had been the day before. Miles of open land stretched on either side, the occasional farmhouse dotting the horizon. James slowed the car, scanning the roadside, looking for any sign of Malik. But the road was empty, save for the occasional rustling of trees in the morning breeze. He pulled into a small gas station, stepping out of his car and into the thick Georgia heat. The station was old, the kind of place that had been around for decades, with faded signs advertising cold soda and fresh bait. Inside, a man in his 60s stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on a rag. James approached, feeling slightly ridiculous. He wasn't even sure how to explain what he was doing there. "Morning," the man said, eyeing him curiously. "Morning," James replied, hesitating for only a second before getting to the point. "I'm looking for a kid named Malik. He helped me out on the road yesterday, fixed my flat tire. I wanted to thank him." The old man raised an eyebrow. "Malik, huh?" He leaned on the counter, thinking for a moment. "Sounds like Charlene Carter's grandson. That boy's always helping folks. Lives over in Pinewood, near the old church." James felt something settle in his chest, a mix of relief and something else, something deeper. "Pinewood," he repeated, committing the name to memory. "Thank you." The man nodded, watching him as he left. James could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he were trying to figure out why a man in an expensive suit was looking for a boy from a town like Pinewood. The drive took just under an hour, but it felt longer. Pinewood was different from Atlanta, different from the world James had built for himself. It was the kind of place where front porches were lined with rocking chairs, where kids rode their bikes in the street, where neighbors actually knew each other's names. The houses were small, some of them worn with age, but there was a quiet resilience in the way they stood, in the way the yards were carefully tended despite the cracked sidewalks and faded paint. James pulled onto a narrow street near the church, scanning the houses, and then he saw it. The home was modest, the porch sagging slightly, but the flower beds in the front were carefully arranged, bursting with color. Someone had taken the time to make this place feel like home. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Stepping out of the car, he walked up the small path and knocked on the door. A few moments passed before it opened, revealing a woman in her early 40s. She had deep brown eyes, filled with curiosity and quiet strength. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. James cleared his throat. "I believe I met your grandson yesterday, Malik. He helped me with my car, and I wanted to thank him." Her expression softened immediately, and for a moment, James saw the resemblance. The same steady gaze, the same quiet confidence. "That sounds like my Malik," she said with a small smile. "He's always helping people." She stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come on in, he's out back." James hesitated, unaccustomed to such invitations. He had spent so much of his life in places where doors remained closed, where meetings were scheduled weeks in advance, where every interaction had an agenda. But here, in this small house, there were no pretense, no negotiations, just an open door and a simple kindness. He stepped inside, taking in the home. The furniture was worn but clean, the walls lined with family photos and hand-drawn pictures that looked like they had been made years ago. It was nothing like his own penthouse, with its sleek furniture and curated artwork, but somehow this place felt warmer, more alive. He followed her through the house and out the back door, where Malik was hammering a wooden plank onto a broken fence. He looked up, surprised to see James standing there. "Mister," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" James smiled, feeling strangely out of place under the boy's steady gaze. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Malik shrugged, his expression easy. It wasn't a big deal, but it was. It was the biggest deal James had encountered in a long time. He looked past Malik to the yard, the patched fence, the uneven grass, the rusted swing set leaning precariously in the corner. It was clear that this family didn't have much. But there was no sense of lack in the way Malik carried himself, no bitterness in his voice. He had given without hesitation, without expectation. James ran a hand over his jaw, searching for the right words. "You don't see people do that much anymore," he finally said. "Help someone without expecting anything in return." Malik tilted his head slightly, as if puzzled by the statement. "I don't see it that way," he replied. "If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I?" The simplicity of it struck James in a way he hadn't expected. He thought of his own past, of the lessons his parents had taught him before he had buried them under years of ambition and competition. He had been that kid once, helping without thinking, giving without keeping score. When had that changed? When had he decided that success meant leaving that part of himself behind? He turned to Malik's grandmother, who had been watching quietly from the porch. "You've done a remarkable job raising him," he said sincerely. "He's got more heart than most people I know." She smiled, her eyes filled with a pride that went deeper than words. "We've had our struggles," she admitted, "but we've learned to appreciate the small things." James nodded, his mind already turning over ideas. He didn't want to insult them by treating this as charity. He wanted to do something that honored the strength they had already built, something that made a real difference. Standing in that yard, surrounded by a family who had given him something he hadn't even realized he needed, he made a decision. He wasn't just going to thank Malik. He was going to change his life. A lesson in true wealth. James stood in the quiet of Malik's backyard, taking in the scene before him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the patchy grass, painting everything in warm gold. The fence, now held together by mismatched planks, stood as a testament to effort rather than perfection. The swing set, rusted and leaning slightly to one side, still held the weight of childhood, even if its chains had long since lost their shine. This place was nothing like the world James knew, yet, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, it felt more real than any penthouse suite or corporate boardroom he had ever stepped into. Malik stood nearby, watching James with quiet curiosity. He was young, but there was something in his eyes, something wise, something unshaken by circumstance. It was the look of someone who had already learned that life doesn't hand out favors, that you make do with what you have and help where you can. James had seen that look before, but not in the circles he usually moved in. It was the look of survivors, of people who understood struggle not as an obstacle, but as a constant presence, one that had to be faced with dignity rather than despair. James exhaled, rubbing his hands together as he turned toward the boy. "You know, when I was your age, I used to fix things too," he said. Malik raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" James nodded, stepping toward the fence and running his hand over the rough wood. "We didn't have much growing up. My father worked 2 jobs. My mother cleaned houses. I remember coming home from school, and there was always something that needed fixing: a leaky faucet, a broken chair, a cracked window. I'd grab whatever tools we had and I'd figure it out." He let out a small chuckle. "Most of the time I didn't do it right the first time, but I learned. I got better." Malik considered this for a moment, then said, "So what changed?" James met the boy's eyes, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. What had changed? At what point had he traded the satisfaction of fixing things with his hands for the rush of building wealth, of stacking numbers in accounts so vast he no longer bothered checking them. "I guess I started chasing something else," James admitted. "I thought if I made enough money, I wouldn't have to fix things anymore. I wouldn't have to struggle." Malik nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "And did it work?" James hesitated. The answer should have been simple. By every measurable standard, he had won. He had climbed out of the life he was born into and built something extraordinary. He had homes in multiple cities, cars that never broke down, assistants who handled every inconvenience before he even noticed it. He had power, influence, the kind of freedom that people dream about. And yet, sitting in his penthouse the night before, staring at his untouched dinner, he had felt empty in a way that no amount of success could fill. And standing here now, in this yard with its crooked fence and overgrown grass, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: grounded, present. He looked at Malik, a boy who had every reason to ask for something, but never did. A boy who had learned that value wasn't measured in what you own, but in what you do. "No," James finally said, "it didn't." Malik gave a small, knowing smile, as if he had expected that answer. James turned toward the house, where Malik's grandmother stood watching from the porch, her expression unreadable but kind. The home was modest, the walls marked by years of use, the furniture worn but cared for. It was nothing like the pristine, curated spaces James occupied, yet it held something his own homes never had: life. He thought about the people in his world: business partners, executives, investors. Conversations were always about deals, about leverage, about what could be gained. Even friendships came with an unspoken expectation of reciprocation. But here, in this house, kindness was given freely. Malik had proven that when he walked away from a handful of crisp bills without a second thought. James took a deep breath, turning back to the boy. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he said. "Your grandmother must be proud." Malik glanced toward the house, his expression softening. "She works hard," he said. "I just try to help out where I can." There was no self-pity in his voice, no resentment, just a quiet acceptance of responsibility, a kind of maturity that wasn't forced but simply part of who he was. James had spent years mentoring young professionals, coaching them on how to climb the corporate ladder, how to negotiate, how to win. But this boy, without ever stepping into an office, had already learned something far more important: the value of showing up, of doing the right thing simply because it was right. James felt something shift inside him, something deep and unspoken. He wasn't sure when he had started believing that success was about moving forward at all costs, about leaving the past behind without looking back. But standing here, in the place where Malik was being raised, he realized something had spent his life running toward a version of success that had stripped him of the very things that once made him whole. He turned back to Malik's grandmother. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," he said. She looked at him carefully, her expression unreadable. "We don't take charity," she said gently. James nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But this isn't charity. It's about what's right. Your grandson helped me, and I want to return the favor." Malik shifted on his feet. "We don't need anything, Mr. James," he said. James smiled, looking between the two of them. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve it." He wasn't thinking about money, not in the way he used to. He was thinking about opportunity, about stability, about giving something back to a family that had unknowingly given him something he hadn't even realized he needed: a reminder of what truly mattered. Malik's grandmother studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," she said softly. "Come inside." James followed them through the door, stepping fully into a home that was nothing like his own but felt strangely more welcoming than anywhere he had been in years. The walls held stories, the furniture held memories, the space itself felt lived in, warm. As he sat at their small kitchen table, a glass of iced tea in front of him, he realized something. He had spent years thinking wealth was about accumulation, about power, about status. But Malik, without ever meaning to, had shown him something different. True wealth wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in the lives you touched, in the people you showed up for. And for the first time in a long, long time, James Whitmore felt rich in a way that had nothing to do with money. A life-changing decision. James had always believed that the greatest power a man could wield was control over his time, his wealth, his future. Every decision he had ever made had been calculated, every risk measured. He built his empire on strategy, on knowing when to push forward and when to step back. And yet, as he sat at the small wooden kitchen table in Malik's home, listening to the soft clinking of dishes and the distant laughter of children playing outside, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, like the ringing of a closing bell on Wall Street or the signing of a multi-million-dollar deal. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, like the first hint of dawn before the world realized it was morning. But it was there. A realization that, for the first time in years, he wasn't making a decision based on numbers or outcomes. He was making it because it felt right. Malik sat across from him, his elbows resting on the table, his fingers absently tracing patterns into the worn wood. He looked relaxed, unbothered by the presence of a man whose name carried weight in business circles across the country. It was clear that wealth and status meant little to him, that his respect wasn't something that could be bought or earned with a simple act of generosity. James found that refreshing in a way he couldn't quite explain. Malik's grandmother, Charlene, placed a plate of cornbread on the table and sat down beside her grandson, folding her hands together. "You said you wanted to do something for us," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "I appreciate that, but we're not looking for handouts." James nodded. He had expected that. "Neither am I," he said. "This isn't about charity. It's about investment." Charlene raised an eyebrow, but she didn't interrupt. James leaned forward slightly, his fingers laced together. "I spent my whole life believing success was about getting ahead, about moving fast and never looking back. I worked hard, I built things, and I made a lot of money doing it. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I started in the first place." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Then I met Malik." The boy looked up, surprised. James gave a small smile. "You reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago, that the best things we do in this life aren't for ourselves, they're for others." Silence filled the room, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. Malik's grandmother studied him, as if weighing the truth in his words. Finally, she nodded. "So what are you thinking?" James straightened. "First, I want to make sure your home is taken care of. Repairs, renovations, whatever needs fixing, I want to handle it. You shouldn't have to spend your time worrying about a leaky roof or a broken fence." Charlene's lips pressed together, and for a moment, James thought she might refuse. But then she glanced at Malik, at the boy who had spent his summer hammering boards onto the old fence, and she let out a quiet sigh. "All right," she said softly, "but only what's needed. No extravagance." James nodded. "Fair enough." Malik looked between them, his brows furrowed. "That's a lot already," he said. "Why do more?" James met his gaze. "Because you deserve more." The boy blinked, as if the words caught him off guard. James continued, his voice calm but firm. "I want to invest in you, Malik, in your future. You're smart, you're capable, and you have the kind of integrity most people take a lifetime to learn. Whenever you want to dow, Heather, it's college, trade school, starting your own business. I want to help you get there." Malik sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James said. "You just have to think about it." The room fell silent again, the weight of James's words settling between them. He wasn't expecting immediate acceptance. He knew that for people like Malik and his grandmother, offers like this often came with strings attached. But there were no strings here, no contracts to sign, no fine print to read. This wasn't about him. It was about giving back in a way that actually mattered. Finally, Malik nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I'll think about it." That was all James needed to hear. The next few weeks unfolded in a way that felt both surreal and deeply satisfying. James made calls, pulled strings, and arranged for the necessary repairs on Malik's home. Contractors arrived to fix the roof, repaint the walls, and reinforce the structure where time had worn it down. A new swing set was installed in the backyard, much to the delight of the neighborhood kids who had once played on the rusted one. James had expected resistance from Malik, expected the boy to refuse any involvement in the work being done. But instead, Malik showed up every day, asking questions, helping where he could, learning. He watched the contractors, studied their techniques, and even picked up a few skills along the way. One afternoon, James found him standing beside a carpenter named Joe, watching intently as the man measured and cut pieces of wood for a new porch railing. "You thinking about picking up a trade?" James asked, leaning against the unfinished railing. Malik shrugged. "Maybe. I just like figuring out how things work." James smiled. That's a good way to think. Doesn't matter what you choose to do as long as you're learning?" Malik nodded, thoughtful. I never really thought about the future much. It's always been about getting through the next day, the next week." He glanced at James. "But now, I don't know. Feels like maybe I should start." James felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent so many years focused on his own future that he had never stopped to think about the people who never got the chance to plan theirs. "You should," James said, "and you don't have to do it alone." By the time the renovations were finished, the house no longer looked worn and tired. It looked cared for, strong, the way a home should. But the real change wasn't in the wood or the paint. It was in the way Malik stood a little taller, in the way Charlene smiled a little more, in the way the entire neighborhood seemed to come alive with the reminder that kindness, when given freely, had the power to transform. On the last day, as James prepared to leave, Malik stood beside him on the front porch. "I don't know how to thank you," the boy said. James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already have." As he walked to his car, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new path, a new purpose, a new kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in bank accounts or business deals. For the first time in his life, James Whitmore understood that the greatest power a man could wield wasn't control. It was the ability to change a life not just his own, but someone else's, and that was a decision he would never regret. Full circle. The morning air was crisp as James Whitmore pulled onto the familiar street in Pinewood. The house that had once been worn and weathered now stood strong, its newly painted exterior gleaming in the early sunlight. The repairs were finished, the work complete, but James knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something inside him had shifted over the past few weeks, something he couldn't quite put into words but felt deep in his bones. He had spent his life closing deals, signing contracts, and measuring success in numbers. But standing here now, watching as Malik raced out onto the porch with an easy, unguarded grin, James understood this was the first time in years that something he had built truly mattered. Malik jogged down the steps, his energy boundless, as if he had already moved on to the next challenge, the next possibility. He had changed over the past few weeks, not in the way that wealth changes people, but in the way that opportunity does. His shoulders were squared, his voice held more confidence, and there was something new in his eyes, spark, a hunger for something more. He had always carried himself with dignity, even when he had little, but now there was an understanding that the world held more for him than just making it through the next day. "You're back," Malik said, slightly out of breath. James smirked, leaning against his car. "Thought I'd check in. Make sure you didn't run off and build a whole house by yourself while I was gone." Malik laughed. "Not yet, but I did help finish the porch railing yesterday." He turned and gestured toward the house, where the wood gleamed in the morning sun. Joe let me do some of the final measurements. Said I had a good eye for detail. James nodded, watching the pride in Malik's expression. He's not wrong. You ever think about doing something with that? Maybe construction engineering? Malik shrugged, but there was a thoughtful edge to the motion. I never really thought about what I'd be when I grew up. Just figured I'd work hard, help my grandma, and see where things went. He hesitated, then added, but now, I guess I do think about it. I like building things. I like seeing something go from broken to fixed. James felt something settle inside him. That's a good way to look at life, he said. Not just letting things stay broken, but figuring out how to make them better. Malik nodded, as if turning the idea over in his mind. Then, after a beat, he asked, "What about you?" James raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" Malik tilted his head. "You've been coming back here a lot. You've done more for us than I think we could ever repay. But I don't think this was just about fixing a house. So what are you going to do next?" James hadn't expected the question, but he should have. Malik had a way of getting straight to the truth of things, cutting through the layers of formality and getting to the core of what mattered. James let out a slow breath, looking past Malik toward the house, the street, the town that had begun to feel oddly familiar. "You know," he said finally, "for a long time I thought the goal in life was to make it to the top, to work harder, move faster, build something bigger, and I did. I got everything I ever wanted. But sitting in my penthouse, looking out at a city that I helped shape, I felt nothing." He paused, then looked at Malik. "Then I met a kid who reminded me that life isn't about what you take. It's about what you build, about who you show up for." Malik smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. James straightened. "So, to answer your question, I don't know exactly what's next, but I do know it's not just going back to the way things were." Malik grinned. "Sounds like you're still figuring things out too." James chuckled. "Yeah, guess I am." The sound of the front door opening made them both turn. Charlene stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You boys just gonna stand out here all morning, or are you coming in for breakfast?" James hesitated, caught off guard by the casual invitation. He had spent years in boardrooms where every meeting was scheduled, every interaction calculated. But here, there was none of that. Just an open door, a warm meal, and the kind of connection money couldn't buy. Malik nudged him with his elbow. "Better say yes. Grandma's cooking is famous around here." James laughed, shaking his head. All right, lead the way." Inside, the house smelled of coffee and warm biscuits, the kind of scent that made a place feel like home. The kitchen was small, the chairs mismatched, but there was something about it that felt richer than any high-end restaurant James had ever dined in. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Charlene talked about the people in town, the families who had lived here for generations. Malik shared more about the work he had done on the house, the skills he was learning, the things he was starting to dream about. And James, he listened, really listened. For so much of his life, he had been the one talking, leading, instructing. But here, in this house, he found himself wanting to learn. When the meal was done and the dishes were being cleared, Malik sat back and folded his arms. "You know, Mr. James, I've been thinking—" James smirked. "That's dangerous." Malik rolled his eyes. "I think one day I want to do what you did." James raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Help people," Malik said simply. "Not just with money, but with real things, with work, with time, with showing up." He paused, then grinned. "Kinda like how you showed up for us." James felt something tighten in his chest, something deep and unshakable. He had spent decades thinking his greatest accomplishment was his wealth, his empire. But sitting here looking at Malik the boy who had nothing and still gave everything, he realized that this was his legacy. Not the buildings with his name on them, Not the businesses he had built, but the lives he had touched. He nodded, his voice steady. I think you're already doing that, Malik. Malik looked down, a small, almost shy smile crossing his face. As James stood to leave, Charlene walked him to the door. You know, she said, people come and go in life. Most don't leave much behind. But I think you're one of the few who actually made a difference here. James met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. I think this place made a difference in me too, he admitted. As he stepped outside, Malik followed him to the car. You coming back? James looked at him, knowing the answer before he even had to say it. Yeah, kid, I'll be back. He got into his car, but before he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Malik stood there watching, the same way he had the first day they met. But this time, it was different. This time, James wasn't just driving away. He was coming full circle, and for the first time in years, he knew exactly where he was going. We often measure success by what we accumulate: wealth, power, influence. We chase after achievements, believing that once we reach the top, we'll finally feel whole. But what happens when we get there and realize something is still missing? James Whitmore spent his life building an empire, but it took a young boy with nothing to remind him of life's greatest truth. Success is not about what we have, it's about who we show up for. Malik didn't change James's life with money, connections, or power. He changed it with Kinessa's simple act, given freely, without expectation. That single moment set off a chain reaction, proving that the smallest gestures can have the most profound impact. In a world that often teaches us to put ourselves first, Malik was a reminder that true wealth lies in generosity, in community, in lifting others up. This story isn't just about James or Malik, it's about all of us. We all have the ability to change lives, whether through our resources, our time, or simply the way we treat people. The question is, will we? Because in the end, the legacy we leave isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in hearts. Thank you for joining this journey of kindness, transformation, and true wealth. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the power of generosity, resilience, and the unexpected ways lives can change. See you next time.